Thank you for being here. I appreciate your being in the class this morning. And thanks again to David for filling in for me last week. And we're going to continue our study of the book of Daniel. We're going to pick up in verse 18 of chapter 5. And this comes right after Daniel has pretty well told the king, you know what you can do with your rewards? Verse 17. That passage says, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to somebody else. Which, if we put it in our language today, you know what you can do with your rewards, where you can stick it? That's kind of where we would think, we'd want to say. Daniel had a character, though, that he didn't quite go the route that we would have gone, had the opportunity arisen. But in verse 18, the king has asked him, what's going on? I understand you're a captive of the Jews and you're supposedly have the ability to tell what dreams are. So what's this writing about? And Daniel now has the floor and he has the attention of everybody in the room. Now this was a huge room. It could easily have accommodated around 1,000 people. There was a number of people here. And when the Lord started scribbling on the wall, it all got shut down real quick, the partying and the drinking and all that they were doing. And now here's probably an 80-year-old man standing in front of the king who has been terrified at what has happened. And now he's got the floor and the attention of everybody in the room. And notice, he didn't just give the interpretation. Look at what he says in verse 18. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle. And his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes. He just didn't give, the king was asking for the interpretation. He just didn't automatically say this is what it means. He gave him a background. He had the floor. And, whenever God gives you the floor, whether it's at work, whether you're talking with someone, whether it's in a particular situation, when God opens that door and gives you the floor, make the most of it for his glory. Daniel didn't have to go back and do all this. As he's going to say in verse 22, you knew all this. He wasn't telling Belshazzar something he didn't know. Belshazzar knew all of this. But Daniel had the floor. He had an opportunity to share the knowledge of God with that whole room. And what he did, he kind of gave a brief history of Nebuchadnezzar. And he noted that, God placed him on the throne, Nebuchadnezzar. He allowed Nebuchadnezzar to become great, to have power, to have authority, to do pretty much what he wanted to do, as he says here. And, it leads to a point that we see that there's a little glimpse, if we will, into the operation of God within the world. And here's a question. Why aren't there only good kings? Why aren't there only good presidents, good leaders, good dictators, if you will, for that matter? If God is in control, why aren't there only good leaders? Sin?
How would you know what good is? How would you know what bad is if you don't ever had good?
Yeah. How do you define good and bad? How would we know? And God never violates human choice. All through God's operations in the world, the Lord always works within, He works around, He works through, He works over, He works in spite of, but He will not refuse you having your personal choice in what you decide to do about your knowledge of God. And it's interesting that as Daniel is bringing this out, he says in verse 22, "But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see, or hear, or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand all your ways, your life and all your ways. Therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription." And, a little board work here. One of the great things about history and experience, if you will, you can call it history, you can call it experiences, ever how you would like to do that. The value of history is in your remembering of history and learning from it. One of the things that we often, as people encounter in life, is all kind of experiences, good, bad, and ugly, for that matter. And we oftentimes get caught up in the emotions of what has happened, rather than out of the memory. We don't even want to remember. I had somebody ask me a question here a while back about some things about my childhood. And one of the questions that was asked is, what do you miss the most? And I said, nothing. There is so much, and I'm sure there was a lot of good, but there was so much that wasn't, that I have shut down that part of my memory. I really don't remember much of my childhood by choice, because some of the memories are just too painful. But that's, and that's a coping mechanism. That's a self-defense mechanism that we often use. But one of the things about our history is that we remember those things to learn from them. One of the things I learned out of all that I have carried, I was thinking about it this morning and going over the Sunday school lesson, I haven't done that either. And that is something that I learned out of my childhood that I said, I'll never do that. And I haven't. I can look back over 70 years of my life and say, no, I haven't done that. I learned out of those experiences. But history leads to memory, remembrance. That should lead to learning. What did you learn from this? Not that it was good, bad, or ugly, or I hated it and I'm sorry and all. What did you learn from it? What did it teach you that you can carry with you into the next experience? And that goes down to choice. This takes us to verse 22, where Daniel told Belshazzar, you knew all of this, but you chose to not humble yourself. You chose not to act on what you learned from Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar was alive when chapter 4 took place. He read probably the proclamation that Nebuchadnezzar sent to all peoples. He knew, but he chose to do something different. And that takes us over to the scales. The hand who holds your life and all your ways is the hand now that wrote the inscription, verse 24. And this is the inscription written. If you have that appendix that I gave each of you, or you had access to, you'll see that there was a copy of the Aramaic words that were written, reading right from left, right to left. That's how the folks in the Middle East wrote and read. And it basically is very simple Aramaic words. Mine, tickle, upharsin. This is what these words mean. Mine, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tikal, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And you see a little chart there that breaks that down. And the words themselves weren't that hard to understand. They were common Aramaic words. But the interpretation of what those words meant was what was so difficult for Belshazzar and for his counselors. And it's interesting, this idea of God weighing on a scale, kings and kingdoms, this is the only place that I can recall. There may be another place, but this is the only place that I can recall in Scripture where God uses the figure of scales in evaluating someone's life. And it really kind of goes back or goes to this point that God has a place and a time. You have history. You should remember it to learn from it. You have a choice on what you're going to do with it. But what was acting out here with Belshazzar is the fact that, there's a line. Nebuchadnezzar was a great king. He could exalt, he could humble, he could do what he wanted, not do what he wanted. But when his heart was exalted, God drew a line and said, you went too far. Belshazzar had crossed the line. And it's interesting that, we're told in Scripture that God holds actions until certain times or conditions are met in His will. And I think that's an interesting thought, especially as in these days in which we're living. And here's, we're going to look at these scales in just a little bit, but think about that God holds certain actions until times or conditions are met in His will before He acts. You remember the length of time to the flood. Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, 120 years. Why didn't He go ahead and do the flood then? Well, Noah was going to need a long time to build the boat, but it was also for the progress of the world to reach that point to where now is the time for the flood. The length of time that the children of Abram would be in Egypt was given in Genesis chapter 15, 400 years. Why? Because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. There was a reason that they remained in Egypt for so long. The birth of Jesus is told in Galatians chapter 4, verse 8, that when the fullness of time had come. Why couldn't He have been born 200 years earlier, 200 years later? That was the right time. Jesus told His disciples, Acts chapter 1, verse 7, that it is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by His own authority for the return. The end times are set to be put into effect when the times have reached their fulfillment. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 10. Over and over again in Scripture, we're told that God knows what the future is, And there is a point in time that things intersect. And that's the point in time that God acts. And he knows where that is. Belshazzar had reached that point. What else was going on? There was a vast army outside the walls of Babylon. What else was going on? While this event was actually taking place and Daniel was talking to him, the river Euphrates was being lowered because the Persians had diverted the waters. The city of Babylon was almost impregnable. But the Euphrates River ran right through the city, and they had various canals off of it. And Cyrus had lowered the water level so that the troops could wade into the city through the water. And the city fell without a battle. A magnificent city, walls 40 feet high, 25 feet wide. The outside wall around Babylon was 17 miles. And it fell without a battle. The Lord had numbered the days and said, your kingdom is now given. And it happened. At Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, gold chain placed around his neck. He was proclaimed third highest ruler in the kingdom that very night. Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. It all met together. Now, it's interesting. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, you've been weighed and found wanting. What was the scales referring to? What was placed on one side of the scales that outweighed what Belshazzar was doing? We're not specifically told, but what was weighed, you can say one side was Belshazzar's behavior, the other side was God's, expectations. What outweighed? What was he doing here that outweighed this and showed that the time had come because of his choices to take the kingdom from him?
To me, he was all about himself.
I'm sorry?
All about himself.
Yes, he was. He was all about himself. And in that all about himself, he made the choice to ignore history. God's expectation was, you knew what happened to your grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. You saw. You knew what had happened. You decided not to learn from history. You decided not to learn to humble yourself before the Lord, but instead you chose to acknowledge the gods of gold, silver, wealth, power. And now your behaviors weighed against what God was expecting of you is now going to cost you. It's a powerful little passage of Scripture. Do we have such in our lives, do you think? Does God weigh us?
Yes.
In what way? How does he weigh us? You knew I was going to say that.
And if you've accepted Jesus as your Savior, that's the biggest way.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, it's what you do with it.
Exactly. Revelation 20. The books are open. Whosever name was not found written in the Lamb's book of life, they're on the wrong side of the scales. At the judgment seat of Christ, we are looked at, what did you build upon that foundation of faith? Gold, silver, precious stones, or wood, hay, and stubble. For the day will examine it, bring it to light, Paul says in Corinthians, and we will either receive the reward or it will be burned up, what we have done. Doesn't mean you'll lose your salvation, but it means the quality of what you have built in your Christian life is going to be, in a sense, in the scales and found wanting. I think the figure of the scales is a powerful figure here within this passage of Scripture. Questions? Comments on any of this? How is this impacting you? What is this saying to you?
Like today, people aren't, the rulers are not looking, and people aren't looking at history. They're looking at what they want to do and what they think's right in their own minds.
Mhm.
And so, they're doing the same thing.
Yeah. And I'm afraid that we're about to get on the scales and be found wanting in some serious ways in our country, in our world.
It's on what God's people do.
Mhm. And I think that when that, and we know that it's going that way, whatever the election holds for us, we know the book of Revelation is going to come to pass. There's, nothing's going to stop that from happening. But when God sees that the time has come, there is going to be, out of the weighing of this world, judgment unlike anything we've ever seen. You can't read Revelation chapter 8, and chapter 9, and chapter 10 and not see just tremendous judgment from God upon this world. And I think it challenges us as a believer to really think about, okay, what does God want from me in my life? What is God expecting of me? As best as we can learn it. And then to seek to fulfill that, to be faithful to that, whatever that is in your life. Because that will be on the side of the expectations. God doesn't expect any of us to be somebody that He knows we cannot be. He expects us to be who He wants us and enables us to be. That becomes the expectations. Now, what did you do with that? How did you handle that? What did you do for me out of that? It's a very interesting little dynamic with that passage. But to wrap up the chapter and get ready to go in chapter 6, verse 30, verse 31, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. In 2 short verses, Daniel describes one of the most significant events in world history. You would think there might be a little more said about it. 2 verses. And in those 2 verses, the fall of an empire, the finishing of the fall of an empire, and the establishment of the Medo-Persian Empire. In other words, the chest and arms of silver that Nebuchadnezzar saw 30-some years ago is now come to pass. So we are introduced at the end of chapter 5 to the new king of Babylon, Darius the Mede. Now, there's a lot of debate as to just who Darius was. And the arguments, if you read commentaries and you read people's statements about it, it runs from this guy was some kind of fictional character made up by this imposter named Daniel, to a man called Gobirus or Gubaru, who was a general of Cyrus, to Cyrus himself, just another name for Cyrus. And the two most likely cases is that this was an actual man, certainly, named Darius, whom archaeologists simply haven't discovered a record of yet. Or it was another name for Cyrus himself. And as the book of Daniel states, that Daniel continued until this first year of Cyrus, really into the third year of Cyrus, because one of the visions that Daniel has happened in the third year of the reign of Cyrus. So it seems that this man, in all probability, is just another name for the King Cyrus. You know, just a little bit of some of the debate that goes on in archaeology and so forth. But the Bible is true, regardless of what the archaeologists find or don't find. So with that, and this is now about 538, 539 BC, we find the Babylonian Empire being wiped away, the establishment of the Medo-Persian Empire. And Daniel is now entering the last years of his life. We see from chapter 10 that he was still alive in the third year of Cyrus. But Daniel's now probably in his 80s. But God has allowed his mind, obviously, and evidently his physical stamina to still be vibrant. And this first year of Cyrus, this first year of his reign was an eventful time, not just for world history, but for the Jewish people. And Daniel was going to be at the center of the fulfillment of prophecy. And the events that we're going to look at in chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den, occurred in Darius' first year in all probability. So it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Now, in these first 3 verses, we're introduced to the political makeup of the Medo-Persian Empire. And what was the satrap? We find it here. Darius appointed 120 satraps. What was a satrap? Administrator. Is administrator, a provincial administrator. And evidently, Nebuchadnezzar had set this up during his reign. And this was a Medo-Persian format, but Nebuchadnezzar was aware of this. He had married a Median king's daughter. And so he was aware of this type of political organization. And the empire was set up into 120 satraps, or satrapies is what the word would be for the province. The guy that was over it, or the governor, the leader of those areas, was called a satrap. And this gentleman was required to pay taxes, in his rule over his little kingdom, part of the empire. He was required to pay taxes to the king, as well as, provide men for the empire's armies and so forth. And in return, the king and the empire would protect their province, their areas, their little fiefdom, if you will. So Darius, recognizing the problem with these little, if you will, just look at the United States. We have 50 states, and we have governors in each one. Same kind of principle here, in a way, loosely. And Darius recognized that these men had so much power and authority that it would be easy for them to foment rebellion within their areas. So he appointed 3 leaders over them to kind of oversee. And one of those 3 was Daniel. 80 years old, he's now in a high government position. And, you know, you kind of wonder, why Daniel? I mean, you know, generally when you have a regime change, all the old is pushed out and all the new is brought in. You know, it's just natural. But he kept Daniel. Maybe when they came into the palace room, they saw the handwriting on the wall. We don't know. But something brought Daniel to Darius' attention, or to Cyrus's attention. And maybe Daniel's reputation, and whatever it was, Daniel still had the ability and was so adept and had so much integrity that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Now, you know, there's a number of lessons right here in just these couple of verses for us. You know, God places people in situations that offer them the ability to demonstrate your faith in a lot of ways. Daniel had just demonstrated it in front of Belshazzar, you know, maybe a couple of months earlier right here. He had demonstrated it before Nebuchadnezzar in revealing dreams. He now was so good by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to, put him over the whole empire. Daniel didn't have to just talk about his belief in the God of Israel. He proved that that God influences one to live a life guided by something other than the normal world's values. And the king saw this. Daniel's abilities and his integrity was able to trump what was normally the culture of that day. Remember, Daniel was still a captive. He was still a member of the captive Jewish people. And now here's a new king who has done away with the old empire. The normal thing would be, let's put all of our people in these positions. And Daniel is still even being considered to be one of the head administrators of the entire Medo-Persian Empire. There was enough there that he should have been just pushed off to the side. And we can say, yeah, God prevented it. Yes, he did. But what did he use to prevent that? Daniel's integrity, Daniel's abilities, Daniel's usefulness, his consistency. The same things that we can have today. That wherever we are, whatever we're doing, we can still produce a testimony that others will be able to see. And, that phrase, exceptional qualities, is literally an exceptional spirit was in him. And one of the things that relates to me, as to others, you're never too old to do something for God until God says you're too old to do it. Daniel was 80-some years old here. And the Lord said, I ain't through with you yet. You got a couple more years, then I'll be done. But there's some things that you've got to see, Daniel, and you've got to write down that's going to happen over the next 2,500 plus years. I need you to write those things down. So we're never at a place that God can't use us. We have to be willing, and we have to utilize what God has given you, the talents, the abilities, the skills. the things that are naturally yours, the things that you've acquired. Use those things to glorify Him. This is what Daniel was doing here. So, one final point out of this, and we see it in verse 4 and 5, we'll pick it up again next week, is that, whenever you are witnessing and you're doing and you're using what God has given you to use, you're going to find people will get jealous of you over those things. And that's what happened here with Daniel. And we'll talk about that next week. Thank you.